Good afternoon and welcome back to the Paris Peace Forum, to this session about boosting financial efforts for people and the planet. As you know, the forum this year is a bit different compared to previous editions. There will be a lot of follow-up and of discussions and reflections on the agenda that was outlined in June here in this same building during the summit that was convened by France earlier this year. So we have a very distinguished panel today with us. We have Jean Likun, President of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Oulimata Sarr, former economy minister of Senegal, and Eric Pedowski, who is vice president in the president's office in the Rockefeller Foundation. So thank you very much for joining me today. Just to let you know, at the end of the session, you will have the possibility to ask questions. So please don't hesitate to raise your hand. And questions are very much welcome, and they can help to have a better debate. So as we were saying before, one of the topics of this session will be to look into the role of multilateral development banks, whether some reforms are needed. Of course, the agenda in Paris in June was very, very ambitious on that side, so we will definitely go into this topic. But more broadly, I think that the big questions that will be underlining our debate is the divide between the north and the south of the world, which was really the basic idea at the beginning of the Paris Peace Forum, and that is still the underlying questions of all our discussions. So we'll definitely go into that. I would like to start with a question for you, Mr. President Jean. So how did you see since June? Did you see some improvement in the way in which multilateral development banks work? Do you see some kind of difference? What progress have been made since then? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you all for coming to this session. You know, in June, I was here, and President Macron called for a new Global Financing Pact. And I think that conference, that forum was very much important. And if you look back over the last couple of months, much progress has been achieved ever since then. So we really, MDBs are working together and try to do better and to do get bigger and to do more. Now, let me highlight some of the. First of all, I would say the awareness of the MDBs about their critical role in pushing for development, growth, and financing for climate change has never been so obvious. I have been in the development business for the last 4 decades, and I think this is the most remarkable achievement. This is also, as you see, very much well received in the G20 meeting, and also Mr. Singh and Larry Summers worked on the harmonization of the different kind of suggestions to produce a report which could help us unlock huge amount of resources. So this is very much important. And secondly, as you see, with IMF and the World Bank taking the leadership, all of the MDBs following suit, you can see the transformative impact over the last couple of months. So the strong sense is MDBs must work together as a system, and this is the clear idea. But MDBs resources pulling together is still very much limited. And so the second achievement is that if financing for commons, financing in commons coalition. Now, this is very much important. Because MDBs working together as a system and then in close collaboration with other funding partners, that could mobilize huge amount of resources. I refer to the number, $23 trillion in assets, and 10% of total global investment flows. It's a huge amount of money. But MDB's resources are limited, but they can mobilize all these resources by working with the private sector. You see, we have a very good dialogue with the sovereign governments, and when the private sector people working with us, we can help them solve some of these macroeconomic or regulatory issues, thereby enabling environment could be substantially improved. The money is moving around the planet every day. What is most important? To help them land in areas they can achieve reasonable returns, thereby enhancing their confidence. And this is our job. And also, I need to highlight the point that the CAF review, Capital Adequacy Framework Review, is very much important.
Thank you very much. I think we'll go back to that, maybe more in details on how this cooperation between multilateral development banks can really deliver sometimes concrete results. I would like still to focus on the June summit with you, Oulimata Sarr, because as you just said, President Jun, the important thing is to make this money land. And there was a very big pledge of 200 billion of extra lending by multilateral development banks. I would like to ask you whether you think that this goal is credible or whether there is a risk, sometimes over-promising, that is sometimes the risk in this kind of summit.
Thank you so much for the invitation. As the Minister of Economy of Senegal, I was co-chairing the working group with Bernard Bardré on the private sector building up to the summit. And I think 3 key takeaways from that conversation regarding the MDBs is that the governments were looking for fast track, scale, and inclusive. Scale, we are failing to reach. And my answer to your question is that we need scale. So the ambition that was laid in Paris, we believe, is not enough. I listened to all the speeches this morning online with the commitments in trillions. And coming from Senegal myself, we have a sense of urgency. As an anecdote, we just shared the results of our national census. The United Nations recommend countries to do their censuses every 10 years, so we just did ours. And for Senegal, 50% of the population is below 19. That's October 2023. We are 18 million people, by the way. And 75% of the population is below 35. So we are young. And the youth wants scale, they want fast track. They see us going to all these conferences, and they want to know, how do we land those billions, trillions to the ground? President Macron mentioned it this morning. There's a disconnect between the big monies that we announce and the communities who are waiting for us. We have to have some form of tiered approach. Yes, we're talking about big money for investment in renewable, in wind, in solar. But in the middle of that pyramid, we have the SMEs who are also looking for solutions. And at the bottom, you've got communities. Our region is the Sahel. And in the Sahel, we don't have to make the choice between development and climate. We need to be able to address the issues of health, of education, of economic empowerment at the same time. We believe that the MDBs can do more. You know, I spent 10 years at the IFC, which is part of the World Bank group. And one of the issues that we have with the MDBs is that they don't deliver as one. And having been in government myself, I see them coming one by one. So one day I have IFD, the following day I have African Development Bank, the following day I have the World Bank. So they come, and I like the idea of delivering as one. The financing, you know, I forgot how they call it, financing as one, or the coalition on financing is critical. Because if you come in individual organizations to our countries and you sit with the policymakers, you are not able to bring that transformative leapfrog that we want. Today, President Macky Sall mentioned it earlier on, Senegal has discovered oil and gas. We promise our people universal access to energy by 2025. That's in 2 years' time. The world is telling us we can't use our gas. Our young people that I just mentioned, 75% of the population, they have dreams, they have ambitions. They would like to see a wealthy Senegal with industries, with jobs. And we cannot say we went to the global stage and we agreed not to use this gas for global public good. Because Senegal is convinced that the people responsible are supposed to pay for it. Who is responsible for pollution? Our continent, Africa, only contributes to 3% of the global emissions. So the 97% that are making that are polluting the world, and I think the Prime Minister of Barbados mentioned it this morning, they should be paying, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's transport. They need to come at the table. And I like the idea of innovative financing. Now we're talking about the fiscal conversation. For the longest time, you know, for gains, for shareholders, profit, the conversation on paying what, you know, if you are a polluter payer, was not really on the table. And countries that are developing like Senegal have to take our limited budget to address issues of climate change, when I'm supposed maybe to spend it on something else. And by the way, all the solutions, all the technological solutions that come before us are from the West, and they are expensive. So I want to finance a solar plant. The financing is not patient. It's 5 years, 10 years max. I believe that the solar plant has a lifespan of 20 years. So maybe I should have financing over a 20-year period. Some countries that are in the Sahel that have extreme weather, if my whole country is underwater, do I still have to service the debt? We talked in Paris in June about debt swap. If I invest in climate adaptation and mitigation, can you give me debt relief? Rather than me paying you money back so you can on-lend it to me back under a resilient fund to address the same issue, give me debt relief. And we commit that this money, this $100 million that you are saying that I would not have to pay back, I am able to invest it in renewable energy, in wind, in solar. Those are what we call innovative financing. The money is already here. How do we use it differently, and how do we innovate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you really set the scene with the underlying question that I was mentioning before. So how countries coming from different regions see things differently, and whether there is a perception sometimes of unfairness on how global finance works. And you also mentioned the fact that what multilateral development banking are promising to lend, it's not enough. And in the Paris Pact, just to go back to that with you, Eric Plofsky, we saw that we had this pledge to lend 200 billion euros of extra lending by multilateral development bank, but we also had this principle that every euro that is lent by a multilateral development bank should be paired with dollar from, that's an interesting lapsus, from $1 from the private sector. So I was just wondering, what is the civil society doing in this big shift that we are looking into, and what the philanthropic sector is doing?
Sure, and let me just start by saying that it's really an honor to be here in Paris with the Mr. President and with Minister Saar. They've been very, very good partners with the Rockefeller Foundation, so we're very grateful to be sitting alongside them. To answer your question about what is classically the private capital mobilization sort of area or rubric, there's a lot of conversation about this. It's a conversation that we've been having for decades. How do we get the private sector to do more, and to do more development, to do more climate? And I don't think, in truth, that we've really we've cracked the nut on this. I think that you look at the record of the MDBs, and it's really, unfortunately, quite disappointing. Obviously, some are doing better than others, but and frankly, the newer banks are being more innovative in doing this. But there's also a challenge where their participation in certain projects actually crowds out the private sector. And occasionally you even have the situation, and just to be clear and honest about this, where the banks are competing with each other to participate in particular projects. And so I think the notion that has been brought forward by the Paris Pact for People and Planet is that the banks are going to operate more seamlessly together. And I think with the new president at the World Bank, with the leadership of President Jin, I have more confidence that that kind of seamless cooperation is going to happen. I was in the U.S. government for a very long time. Big bureaucracies have trouble cooperating and working together. It's just a function of size and the magnitude of the task. When you get down to it, these are complex projects in complex countries, and then you want to insert 3 or 4 banks that have their own complexity and want them to all work together. It requires not just the complexity to be solved, but it has to be leadership, that the banks are telling all of their workforce, this is a new way of doing it. We are not competing against each other. We're working together to get projects done so that the outcomes are the success, not the banks themselves. And I think that vibe, to use a terrible American term, is starting to creep into the banks in a much more effective way. And so I don't think in any way that this is a function of bad motives on the banks or their workforce. I think it's just that instinct to serve the bank you work in and the project you're working on. And so I think that new vibe has really, I think, taken hold. But the block and tackling, the actual work of getting these projects and this cooperation going, I think will be the sort of next challenge. And private capital mobilization ultimately is about getting companies to see that investing in Africa or investing in Asia or investing in Latin America is where they want to be. And so when it comes down to it, with high interest rates, you don't have to be very brave to make money. And so we're asking companies to actually look more clearly, look past their biases about these emerging markets to what the realities in these countries are. And that also means that the credit rating agencies have to be more fair as they assess the countries that they're analyzing and giving ratings for. This is unfortunately a multi-factor problem with a multi-factor solution. And it really, the value of the Paris Summit, the value of this convening is that we're having a conversation that acknowledges the complexity and works through it. And so the leadership of the minister, the leadership of President Jin have been that kind of instrumental movement forward to actually get this kind of thing done.
Thank you very much. I mean, you mentioned several topics. We will go back to some of those after. I find particularly interesting what you said about the bias that the private sector sometimes still has for certain countries or for investments in certain countries. But you mentioned before the vibe, and Minister Di Matassar, you were saying that, of course, especially for African countries, I think that a change of vibe is not enough, is not a very concrete deliverable. So I wanted to ask you, President Jin, when it comes to this leadership of multilateral development banks and this dialogue between the leaders of the banks, has it already brought some concrete results, some concrete deliverables that resulted from this new vibe that started in June here?
You see, I fully agree with you about the need for the MDBs to finance in a new approach. Reform is needed for them to have a new lease of life. And I think what is most important for us to understand that we have to think about the way whether we need to have some change in financing for development. Or business as usual is not an option. We have to be more cost effective, faster without compromising the quality, particularly with regard to social and environmental framework. So there are lots of things we need to do. I have always highlighted the point that in order for the AMDBs to be effective, to be relevant, to be adaptive, we have to change. Now, the AMDB's working as system is a great incentive for us to really have a review of the approaches and see how can we work together. We are new, and we do not have historical luggage. So that's why we could be very lean, and we can move faster. So I think by working together is very much important. And I like to highlight also another point, competition and coordination. We should not compete for some projects if we find that this is a very good project, just to grab it. That kind of thing is not going to work. But competition means we will work together, try to see how we can be most effective, cost-effective, and also efficient. And then we learn from each other. So you see, we have been working very closely with the World Bank, ADB, and other institutions, because we believe only by working together could it be possible for some projects to be done by really high standards. And if you simply compete to get project, you're racing to the bottom. And you see, we have worked with the World Bank very, very effectively in a number of areas. Now, how to mobilize private sector financing? Of course, we understand private sector investors look for profits, but they do not necessarily look at the highest possible return and put their money in, because this obviously means there are risks. So when we work with the private sector investors, we assure them that we would like to have a very good dialogue with the governments to improve the regulatory framework, macroeconomic situation, and to protect your legitimate interests. So even if you probably will not have the highest possible returns, but a little bit lower return is more assured. So there are lots of things we can do together, and I believe moving forward, as long as we are genuinely committed to be working together to promoting development, we can achieve something. Now, a few words about Sub-Saharan Africa. We have quite a number of Sub-Saharan Africa members. They join us, and we help them. And for instance, we have already financed a rural road project in Côte d'Ivoire. That project reaches all the way to the remote areas and helping the rural people to have their agricultural products shipped out and be exported to Asia. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, I think we really have to have a new approach developing infrastructure. The last point is, do not set infrastructure project against climate change financing and mitigation, as if they were two separate things. It's not true. Infrastructure projects should be designed, implemented, and maintained in a new approach with digital technology, with new IT technology, substantially reduce the costs. And also renewables could be done. Renewable projects are infrastructure, but they are renewables, right? So my view is financing climate change should permeate all the traditional infrastructure projects. Thereby, they are actually closely interlaced, not separated. We should change the mindset about that. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I was wondering, since you mentioned Africa and investments of multilateral development banks in the continent, to you, Minister Limatasar, how do you have the feeling that sometimes the intervention of multilateral development banks can, I mean, the real logic of lending instead of finding other forms of finance can lead to something that some could describe as a debt trap, or you could see, at least for some countries, the risk of being in a vulnerable situation as debtor in those situations?
Thank you for your question. Let me talk about Senegal that I know best. Senegal 85% of our budget is Senegal's money. A lot of people don't know that. It's our taxes, it's the VAT, it's duties, you name it. And the gap is the 15% that we go to the market to get through concessional funds or others. Senegal believes that to bring about change, you need to work on 5 things at the same time. You need to work on policies, so you need to have an enabling environment for private sector to thrive. We have a good example. I think the country is a poster child of private sector investing in the energy sector. 70% of Senegal's power is generated by independent power producers, IPPs. So once you design your policy, your regulatory framework to make your country attractive, you have to address the issue of skills. How do you build competencies? And today, the competencies that we are trying to build are in the renewable sector, in the energy sector, in the gas to power sector as a country. Thirdly, to bring about transformation, you have to address the issue of financing. And all the developing countries, les pays émergents, agree that they need patient capital. Third is access to markets. How do you go as a country beyond Senegal and see yourself as a player in your region and as a player on the continent? And we have, as you know, as the African Union, the ZLECAf, which is a free trade zone of Africa. And the last pillar of that transformation is infrastructure. A road, access to energy, access to water, access to technology. Roads, we have been very successful under the 11 years of President Macky Sall's leadership. Senegal has multiplied highway and roads by threefold, with a lot of investment, but also with private sector investment. My call for action for the MDBs is really scale. If I had to summarize my statement today, is that we want to see more funding. I like the idea of having this financing conversation at a peace conference, because I come from a region where we believe that the biggest threat to peace is poverty. The biggest threat to peace is poverty. We can be talking about peace as much as we want, but if somebody thinks that there's no future, then they are able, they can be enrolled in some form of violent extremism. They can do extreme things because they see no future. So in order to help governments such as Senegal and others in the Sahel, our call for action building up to the COP is scale. Maybe we'll talk about the loss and damages fund that will be announced in Dubai. We believe that this Paris in June and now, this is all the journey to the COP in 28. I was very surprised that there's no country has raised their hand for COP 29. Aren't you worried? I was worried when I heard that this morning. Meaning nobody wants to take the torch like we do in the Olympics. Because they know that if 1 year from now, people are impatient. The sense of urgency of the young people of the world is that we are not going to another conference where we come back and say there's pledges to the loss and damages. No pledges. Money is on the table. Here's a check. That's what people want to hear. When I joined government, there was this big conversation about the SDRs. You remember the SDRs, Eric? Special drawing rights. Eric and I have been in the trenches together. And people were saying, this is reserve that is at the IMF, make it available for other countries to use so they can go through COVID. Remember, COVID was the crisis. And our countries, my country, Senegal, just got the head out of the COVID crisis. Then the Ukraine-Russia war came with inflation, and commodity prices going higher and higher. So we are in a constant state of crisis. And in order to address those crises, I think we need the coalition of the willing. We need private sector, MDBs, global philanthropy, governments, NGOs, civil society organizations, everybody at the table to put our creative minds together to find innovative and solutions that are fast track. I think that really, Giorgio, the headline is fast track for me. Thank you.
Thank you. So I was wondering whether, I mean, it comes down again to the initial question of pledges against concrete achievable things. So I wanted to ask to you, Eric, whether you feel that when it comes to the philanthropic sector, there are some accelerations, some very concrete deliverables that have appeared since the June summit, or things like new ways of working that have emerged since then, or you think that the discussion has just started, so there is still a lot of work to do on that?
I think it's both. I think there have been some very important successes, and I think there's a lot more to do. My current favorite person to quote, besides the minister, is Prime Minister Motley, and she says over and over again that we cannot go to COP28 with more pledges. We have to go with a record, and I can't think of anything that is more right, and which is more scary, because that means we've got a lot of work between now and COP28. I would say there are a couple of things I just point to, and obviously each philanthropy has their own list, but where philanthropy I think can make a difference, frankly, is in 2 or 3 categories. And certainly one of the first categories is risk capital. The ability of a philanthropy to fail in a way that governments and MDBs are not allowed to fail is really important. We are allowed to test pilots. We are allowed to get away with trying something, not knowing if it's going to work or not. And that risk capital is one of our most valuable things. On the other hand, it means that we have to be really careful to do it thoughtfully so that we're not just throwing it away. But you've seen lots of different philanthropies commit money to brave things, Breakthrough Energy, our Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, IKEA and Bezos and Rockefeller have put $1.5 billion into a Global Energy Alliance aimed at providing green energy access to the whole world.
And can you tell us more how this kind of project, for example, works concretely? So, like the concrete impact on the countries that are...
Well, one of the very important projects that they're looking at is battery development, so that you have a way to flatten out your electrical production from solar and wind. So that's a very concrete thing. It's the Rockefeller and the Bezos and IKEA are working together to create a global consortium that will buy batteries, develop them, and basically deploy them, so that solar and wind are able to be used throughout the day, throughout the night, that sort of thing. So that's one very concrete thing. The other thing I want to talk about is risk diplomacy, because a lot of the philanthropies are getting much more involved in the policy and advocacy space and bringing together governments in a way that the governments haven't been sitting down together, and using that vehicle to move some of the most critical elements of reform down the field. And the one I want to highlight is, excuse me, the capital adequacy framework reform. This is something where the banks have got to look at their balance sheets and determine whether they've got more headroom based on their existing money. And so ADB, I'll just pick on the ADB for a minute, announced a couple of weeks ago that they had looked at their capital adequacy and concluded that they had $100 billion worth of new headroom that they were going to deploy. The World Bank has made the decision to change their equity to loan ratio by 1%. It added $50 billion to their headroom. We think, based on a study that Rockefeller paid for, that the World Bank has another 150 billion that they could deploy at the IBRD. So there is real money in these banks, and it's a combination of risk diplomacy and risk capital that philanthropies are using to push the system to do more.
Thank you very much. And just to maybe go back to you, President Jin, on the role of multilateral development banks. There is, again, the new role, climate finance, that is really the topic of our discussion. But then there is the traditional role of multilateral development banks, which is a lot about infrastructures that are not necessarily green infrastructures, but that are still needed. So do you see a tension in the role of multilateral development banks, and in particular the one you're the president of?
You see, if you look at the history of the World Bank over the last 7 decades, and ADB half a century, EBRD 30 years, you see, basically all those development banks started as the multilateral development bank pushing for infrastructure development. And then you see, as they evolved, they start to shift some of the attention to social sectors and or environmental protection projects on their own. This is the very good progress, because shifting from physical infrastructure to social infrastructure and taking care of the climate change, environment, biodiversity, or promoting gender balance, empowering women, all these kind of things, in my view, are very, very good progress. And then you'll find there will be less resources for infrastructure development. There's a huge gap in infrastructure development in Asia, to say nothing of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, or even in Latin America. The basic infrastructure is also a big issue. And if you look at infrastructure built 30, 40 years ago, they cry out for upgrading. And upgrading is important for them to be more energy efficient, right? But in most of cases, because of lack of resources, it is not possible to upgrade those infrastructure. And because of this fact, and AIIB was being conceptualized and designed as a new development bank pushing for infrastructure development to supplement the efforts of the existing, or we call it legacy institutions. Now, the issue is we should not simply finance infrastructure the way we did 30, 40 years ago. So a lot of things must be changed to make sure that the present day, in the present day world, infrastructure must be supporting broad-based economic, social development, and at the same time protect the environment, biodiversity, and dealing with climate change. So as I said previously now, these two kinds of efforts must be combined. Particularly, we need to think about what kind of infrastructure projects should we do. For instance, we finance a lot of mass transport projects so that people will not have to drive their individual cars, particularly when developing countries are lifting a lot of people out of poverty. Instantly, you will find a huge demand for power, for safe drinking water. One solution of the existing problem will lead to another problem for us to solve. You simply cannot stop the people from enjoying a better life. I heard some of the political leaders said, I cannot possibly imagine every Chinese will take a shower in the morning. You don't do it. Is this the solution? And I don't think so. I think that does not mean that with growth of economy and living standard improvement, we definitely would have to use more natural resources. I think if we think from a different perspective, perhaps economic development, technological advancement can help us meeting the needs of the people without depleting the natural resources. This is possible.
Thank you. I think that this example that you've made of, I mean, this statement, I don't know who was the politician who talked about Chinese people having shower, but I really feel that it kind of shows us this reflection of unfairness that you were doing also before, Minister Oulimata Sarr, about the fact that there are a group of countries asking the others to make an effort for a problem that they haven't caused, or at least for the past centuries. And we see again this dynamics, this tension in many little files ahead of the COP28. Sorry, not little files, but very big files, like the one, for example, of the loss and fund. On loss and damage fund. That will be again one of the big files of the COP28, but where we see again a split between countries on how this fund should work, whether it should be managed by the World Bank, whether there should be a voluntary contribution to it or not. So I wanted to ask you, Oulimata Sarr, whether you feel that the approach from richer countries, if we want to simplify, is they're still not making pledges being followed by facts and by extra effort. And is this a good example of how things are still not working?
Jojo, I would like to talk about reforms, and I think Eric will agree with me. Everybody agrees that the world of 1945 is not the world today. And the institutions of Bretton Woods, the United Nations, all the large institutions are not a true reflection of what the world is today. I was very happy to hear somebody mention this morning that the roles of the MDBs in the world based on GDP is still marginal, meaning the economies of the world are not based on the financing of MDBs. I know for a fact that in my country that's the case, because most of our financing is coming from us. Our biggest worry with MDBs, and I mentioned it during the annual meetings of the Islamic Development Bank, of the African Development Bank, I see an increased commitment of the MDBs to their AAA rating. I know that I meet now some of their staff, and the rating of their MDBs is on their business cards. The rating agencies for policymakers and people in government like ourselves is that even the rating agencies needs to be reformed. And I give you an example. In Africa, all the big rating agencies, whether it's Fitch, Standard & Poor's, you name it, they don't have offices on the continent. I think one of them has an office in Johannesburg. And those are the rating agencies that define the risks of our countries. We had a whole panel in Washington about it. If something is happening in Mali, Senegal is affected. If something is happening in Central Africa, the whole of Central Africa is affected. And then we feel that the MDBs are so much interested in keeping their AAA rating that they are losing their DNA, which is development. I have this conversation when I was a minister with some of them, and they will tell me, well, I have to keep my AAA rating and my exposure to Senegal is too great. We reach our threshold based on our, if we want to find cheap money, we have to keep our AAA rating. Well, you find cheap money that you can no longer give to my country because your exposure to my country is too great. So the whole conversation about rating agencies is very important. The IMF is a lender of last resort. As a country, when you no longer can go to market, you will go into the arms of the IMF. And the IMF will tell you, I can give you money for zero interest rate, Kristalina mentioned this morning, or a very, very low rate. But I will also put a list of conditions in terms of fiscal governance that you have to put in place, discipline. We feel as governments that the IMF and the World Bank are what we call compliance banks. You go to the board, they approve a project. I remind the sense of urgency. 6 months later, it's still in somebody's few people's desk being checked, some checklists being checked. And for 6 months, the beneficiaries, the ultimate beneficiary, is still working. Because once it was approved by the board, it made news headlines. $100 million going to Senegal for I don't know what. 6 months later, the money has still haven't hit the ground. So I was very delighted this morning when they talked about their processes. I was one of those paper pushers. I spent 10 years at the IFC. And I know that we used to be bureaucracies, that, you know, we want to make sure that we check all the boxes, that everything is clear. And in 2023, when the world is going through crisis, we cannot take the same amount of time. And we were able to learn during COVID that we can do things faster. Do you realize how fast we went during the COVID? Meetings happened overnight. Rules were changed overnight. Things that needed to be accelerated were accelerated overnight. So when the world was in dire straits, we were able to leapfrog. We were able to accelerate reform. We believe as the continent, Africa and Senegal, that we are in that same state of emergency. So the rules don't need to be changed in 6 months' time at the next meeting. They need to be changed now.
Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on what you just said about rating agencies. I mean, would you feel that there is still a bias in the way in which some countries are rated? And I mean, those are private companies. They more or less do what they want. So what, again, to go back to the question of concrete solutions, how can we concretely try to remove that bias if it exists?
Yes, it's a very good question because everybody tried. When you're facing a conglomerate, because that's what they are, the rating agencies. They are a group of private sector people who are giving, rankings to different countries. And I vividly remember one of the rating agencies downgrading France, and Bruno Le Maire was on the news. So you cannot control them. We saying to them, come on the ground. Senegal is a center of excellence in terms of statistics. The data is available because they're saying that the rating is 80% based on data and 20% is on the analysis. And what we are saying that the analysis is not good enough. So some ideas are on the ground. If you remember, during the mandate of President Macky Sall at the head of the AU, there was a big conversation about having a rating, a Pan-African rating agency, to be able to see two sides to the story. Yes, S&P can say, this is what I feel about Senegal, but somebody can say, this is what I feel about Senegal or Côte d'Ivoire. Very different. I like to remind people that some of the countries, when they were even at war or in crisis, were still paying their debt. They were still paying their debt, meaning that the assessment of risk that the rating agencies give to our countries is exaggerated. So if I go and borrow $100 million, a rating agency will say, Senegal is going to elections in 4 months' time. We think that the place is risky. I believe my country is not risky. I believe that, in 2022, we went through 3 elections. We went through our local elections. We went through our parliamentary elections. We went to the election of our Haut Conseiller. And Senegal is still standing. So when the assessment of our country is that, oh my God, there's elections, so the whole place is falling apart, we disagree. Because when I joined government, I find a solid administration. I find people who were highly, highly skilled. My own assistant served 4 Minister of Finance and Economy. So I know as a leadership, I'm in transition. I will move. But Senegal will still stand. And we feel that the rating agencies don't have that perspective. They feel that some of the countries are based on individuals. That if Macky Sall goes tomorrow, what's going to happen to Senegal? Senegal will still be standing. That's my feeling.
Thank you very much. I mean, we're getting closer to the end, but I would like to ask you, Eric Pulaski, a question on a topic we haven't mentioned yet, which is taxation, which was a big part of the agenda of the summit here in June. And again, it's seen, of course, as probably the biggest, the most powerful tool to mobilize, to find resources, to finance the climate transition. And since June, the basically main deliverable that we have is this task force that will work on it, including at the COP28. So again, the taxation is the way by which the private sector is mobilized and in the way in which they can really make a contribution to this effort. Do you feel that these options that are on the table, are they real? Like, for example, the idea of a tax on financial transactions, like how many chances this kind of proposal have to really succeed? And don't we risk that, again, we have another pledge on taxation again at the COP28 this month?
I'm curious how this question was distributed, but no.
Just following the order. It's totally random, so it was your turn.
So there's a joke in Washington that when you go to Congress and you want to talk about taxation, you don't tax this guy, you don't tax this woman, you tax the man standing behind the tree because he's far away. And so I think if the question is, are these proposals credible? I think they're absolutely credible. I think, I spent some time with Prime Minister Motley yesterday, and I can tell you that the point of view is that everybody needs to pay their fair share is pervasive. All you have to do is listen to President Biden about talking about how billionaires should pay their fair share. I think there is I think they announced this morning a formation of a committee. Laurence Toubiana is going to help lead this, and she's been doing incredible work on this subject to outline concrete proposals, to tee them up. But in the end, taxation is about political will. And that political will doesn't just exist in governments, it exists on the streets and in the schools and in the civic centers of every country involved. And so if people think that the taxation isn't fair or isn't appropriate to the needs of the countries out there, they need to be conveying that to their governments, to their leaders, to their decision makers, and the people who vote in their parliaments and legislatures. Because fundamentally, that's how these things are going to get done. I just have to point to, there's a list of taxation. There's oil and gas, there's the shipping, there's aviation, and what I think one has to look at is everybody wants to know where these taxes fall really, because does it fall on the shipper or does it fall on the person getting the shipping, right? Because quite oftentimes the analysis doesn't really tell you the whole story. And so there was a session almost immediately, days after the June summit of the IMO, and there was a very fierce debate about one of the most likely taxes that was being considered, which was on shipping, to decarbonize maritime shipping. And the proposal basically went nowhere. It's on life support. So when you ask, are these proposals concrete? Are they serious? Absolutely. Are they making progress?
Yeah, that was more of my question. Like, are they making progress? And if we take that example, it's very disappointing.
Yeah, and so I think you have to, and so I would say this task force that Laurence and others are going to set up, I think provides a more hope that something will happen so that you can address the climate needs. But the connection between the taxation and the need has to be direct. Because I think nowadays, people being asked to pay more need to understand the connection. I think oftentimes citizens are quite happy to pay additional taxes when they know where the money's going. But once you disappear into this vast ether where you don't know where the money's going, political will collapses.
Yeah, thanks. It's really a matter of political will, and as you said, a bit diplomatically at the beginning, but not very explicitly. It's very hard sometimes to make people accept this kind of principle. You have a big political cleavage, I think, on this kind of taxation. But our time is running out. So, are there questions from the audience? We would be very happy to take some. Yeah, I think do you have a microphone? No, you will.
Hi, thank you so much for your insights. My name is Zahir. I'm from Bangladesh. So, you spoke about money landing. I hope it lands in my country, but no pressure. My question was actually about callable capital. That's something I've been very curious about with MDBs. All MDBs possess some amount of callable capital. That's almost like a guarantee from member countries. But a lot of MDBs don't factor this in when lending money in their risk calculation. And this is a question I have is why isn't this being factored in? And if it is a point of MDB reform, how can we move into that reform? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Callable capital, in my view, it certainly is a very much, I think, ingenious creation. It is the contingent liability of the sovereign governments. The paid-in capital accounts for certain amount. In the case of the World Bank, 20% or 21% is paid in, but hard currency accounts for 3 or 4%. The rest is the local currency deposited in the central bank. Our bank paid-in capital is 20%, much, much, much bigger than the traditional banks. Now, callable capital, is it working? It is. But callable capital has never been called. Because if the callable capital is called, it means that the bank in question is in deep trouble. So callable capitals will never be touched. But is the callable capital working? Yes, it is. Why? For instance, if you have a $100 billion bank, whatever the paid-in capital, you can raise funds from the capital market on the basis of 100 billion, not on the basis of the paid-in. So it is working. It is helping. What worries the rating companies, and we have to, rating companies cannot be escaped. What worries the rating companies is if the assets deteriorates, or if the assets is perceived to be deteriorating. As you were saying, the country's rating goes down. Does not mean they will not pay back. Right, so it's perceived deteriorating, and then the management of the multilateral banks would have to shrink their lending program. So what I'm thinking about the real need for rating companies to reconsider their methodology. First, they should not rate the countries such as Sub-Saharan Africa by working remote. They don't really know what's going on. I'll give you one example. It's my country. I'm sorry, time is running out. In 1992, they want to downgrade China for whatever reason. And 1997, they want to downgrade China again because of the Asian financial crisis. But there were some guys in the rating company who says, downgrade what? Because China's system is different from the system of Poland. Poland's democracy, and Hungary's democracy. They definitely should have a higher rating. Okay? And then somebody said, you downgrade China. What is the rating you assign China in 1985? What is the China's GDP now? What is China's foreign exchange reserve now? Downgrading, what's the basis? So this is a problem. Okay, my view is rating companies should rate the sovereign governments, rating the commercial banks or business companies, and MDBs with 3 different kind of methodology. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, you wanted to follow up on that? We have a minute.
I'll be as fast as I humanly can. I'm glad you brought up callable capital. Couple of things just on that. The study that Rockefeller paid for by Risk Control actually shows side by side how the different credit rating agencies rate the MDBs. The variance is massive, and the degree to which there is sort of no standard way to do it is really interesting. And I commend the study to you to actually see, because it takes it apart, piece by piece, how these ratings are constructed. And you'll see how much is quantitative and how much is qualitative. And it's really important what's qualitative. On callable capital, the study showed that IBRD, if you were to construct it using the callable capital as equity, has almost $894 billion of additional headroom lending. Now, of course, nobody's going to do that, and the credit rating agency would have to come along. But callable capital is a very viable way to increase the headroom of all of these banks. The United States and several other countries have gone to the banks and asked them to fill out a survey about their callable capital, and at the same time required all of the major countries to do a similar survey so that there can be a genuine dialogue with the goal of reaching a different way of approaching callable capital for headroom purposes, for lending purposes, by April. Now, I don't know if they're going to make it, but they're definitely a process going forward to adapt and use callable in a more meaningful way. Now, I would hold the MDBs feet to the fire on callable, because there really is an opportunity to do more lending on the basis of it. And the countries and the MDBs need to be held to this task.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sorry for the questions that could have been asked, but maybe you can try to approach the speakers right after. I think that we are obliged to stop. We have a hard
We will not leave this stage
deadline
without giving the floor to one woman. Please, give
You're
her the
totally
mic.
right. I'm
She
sorry
has
about
2
that. Please
seconds
ask your
to say
question.
something. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Merem Tar. I'm the first representative of my indigenous people of the north of Chad, who are the Ga. And now we are going to the COP 28 about loss of damage. And it's not a question about just money, but adaptation too. And how we can include more youth people about loss and damage. Because we speak all day, we need more youth people, with people, but in the negotiation, we are not here.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you for your contribution and your beautiful country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.